The first time Clara Bennett grabbed my hand in that hospital hallway and begged me to pretend to be her husband, I thought she had lost her mind, but I would later understand that she was simply trying to save her daughter's life the only way she knew how. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in hope, and in the quiet miracle of second chances, I want you to like this video, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel, because we tell stories like this one every single week, stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things for the people they loved. My name is Grant Whitfield, and before that Tuesday afternoon in late September, I had never spoken more than a few polite words to Clara Bennett. I knew her the way you know someone in a small town, by sight, by reputation, by the version of her life that floated around in conversations at the hardware store and the church potluck. She was the young widow who ran the flower shop on Elm Street, the one whose husband, Daniel, had died in a car accident 2 winters before, leaving her alone with a 5-year-old daughter named Nora and a mountain of grief she carried so quietly that most people in town didn't even know how heavy it was. I worked at the accounting office 2 doors down from her shop, and some mornings I would see her through the window arranging tulips before the sun was even fully up, her daughter sitting on a stool doing kindergarten homework beside buckets of roses. I never imagined that our lives would become tangled together, but grief has a way of reaching out and pulling in whoever is closest when it needs help. That Tuesday, I had gone to the hospital because my grandmother was having a routine checkup, and I was sitting in the waiting room scrolling through my phone when Clara came rushing down the hallway, her face pale, her hands shaking so badly that the coffee cup she was carrying had already spilled down the side and onto her sleeve. She didn't seem to notice. She was looking for someone, scanning every face in the waiting room, and when her eyes landed on mine, something in her expression shifted, like she had just found the answer to a question she hadn't even known how to ask. She walked straight up to me, close enough that I could see the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, and she said the words that would change the next year of my life. She told me her daughter's grandfather, a stern and wealthy man named Walter Kensington, was upstairs in a hospital room, and that he had come from 3 states away because Nora had been rushed in after a bad asthma attack, and that Walter had made it very clear, more than once, that he believed Clara was unfit to raise his granddaughter alone, that a child needed a father, a stable home, a man in the house, and that if Clara couldn't prove otherwise, he intended to take the matter to a lawyer and fight for custody, using the resources of his family's name and money to make sure he won. I want to pause here and tell you something important about the kind of desperation that makes a woman ask a stranger to lie for her. Clara was not a manipulative person. She was not looking for an easy way out. She told me later, once we had come to know each other's hearts, that she had spent 11 months trying to reason with Walter, trying to show him bank statements and school records and every ounce of proof that she was doing right by Nora, and none of it mattered to him, because in his mind, a widow raising a daughter alone was a wound that needed fixing, not a life that needed respecting. When Nora's asthma attack sent them all rushing to the hospital that afternoon, Walter had stood in the hallway and told Clara, in front of a nurse and a stranger passing by, that this was exactly the kind of thing that happened when a child didn't have a stable 2-parent household, that stress and chaos were making his granddaughter sick, and that he was done waiting for Clara to fix things on her own. Clara said she felt something break open inside her chest, not out of anger, but out of pure terror, the terror of a mother who has already lost one part of her family and cannot bear the thought of losing the rest. And when she looked around that hallway and saw me, a stranger in a gray sweater with kind eyes, sitting quietly by myself, something desperate and instinctive took over. She asked me, right there, if I would come upstairs with her, just for a few minutes, and pretend to be her husband, just long enough to give Walter one reason to pause, one reason to believe that Nora had a home with 2 people who loved her, so that he would leave town without calling a lawyer that same day. She promised she would explain everything, she promised it would only be that one visit, and she promised she would never ask me for anything else as long as she lived. I should have said no. Every rational part of me knew that agreeing to a stranger's desperate request in a hospital hallway was not a wise decision, but there was something in the way she said Nora's name, the way her voice cracked on the word daughter, that reached into a place in me I didn't know was still tender. 3 years earlier, I had lost my younger sister to leukemia, and I remembered, with a clarity that still ached, what it felt like to watch someone you love become a bargaining chip for people who claimed to love them too, family members arguing over treatment decisions and living arrangements while my sister lay in a hospital bed listening to every word. I looked at Clara, and I saw a woman standing exactly where my mother had once stood, trying to protect a child from being pulled apart by the people who were supposed to be protecting her instead. So I told her yes. I told her I would go upstairs with her, and I would do whatever she needed me to do, just for that one afternoon. Walter Kensington was exactly the kind of man I expected him to be, tall and silver-haired, dressed in a suit that looked out of place in a hospital corridor, with the kind of posture that suggested he had never once in his life doubted that he was right. When Clara introduced me as her husband, Grant, I watched his eyebrows lift with surprise, and then, slowly, with something that looked almost like relief, as if part of him had wanted to be wrong about Clara all along and simply needed a reason. I shook his hand, and I told him how worried I had been about Nora, and I asked about her breathing treatments with a steadiness I did not feel inside, and for 20 minutes, I existed as a man I was not, a husband and a father, standing beside a woman I had met less than an hour before. When we finally stepped into Nora's room, I saw her for the first time, a small girl with dark curls and an oxygen tube resting gently beneath her nose, her eyes wide and tired, and when she looked at me, she didn't ask who I was. She simply reached out her small hand toward mine, and something in my chest cracked open in an entirely different way than it had in the hallway. Walter left the hospital that evening without mentioning lawyers. He hugged Nora goodbye, shook my hand again with something that felt like genuine warmth, and told Clara he was glad to see she wasn't as alone as he had feared. I remember standing in the hospital parking lot afterward, the autumn sun low and orange across the sky, watching Clara lean against her car and finally let herself cry, not out of sadness but out of the exhausted relief of a mother who has just watched a threat pass by her daughter's door. She apologized to me over and over, and she told me I never had to see her again, that she would find some other way to handle Walter in the future, that she never should have pulled me into her life like that. But I found myself telling her, almost before I had decided to say it, that I didn't mind, that I was glad Nora was safe, and that if she ever needed anything again, she could call me. I want to tell you now about the year that followed, because it did not unfold the way either of us expected, and it did not unfold quickly, and there is something important in that slowness, something that I think our whole culture has forgotten how to value. We are told that love should feel like fireworks, like lightning, like something that strikes you all at once and changes everything overnight. But what happened between Clara and me was nothing like that. It was slow, and quiet, and built one small daytime kindness at a time, the way a house is built brick by brick rather than appearing whole out of nowhere. Walter did not disappear from their lives after that hospital visit. In fact, within a few weeks, he called Clara and told her he wanted to visit again, this time not because of an emergency but because he wanted, in his words, to see how his son's family was doing. Clara called me that evening, her voice tight with anxiety, and asked if I would be willing to come to Sunday lunch, just once more, just to keep the peace a little longer while she figured out a long-term plan. I agreed again, and this time I met them at Clara's small house on Birch Avenue, a cheerful yellow house with a wraparound porch that Daniel had painted the summer before he died. Walter arrived precisely on time, carrying a bouquet of flowers for Clara and a wrapped gift for Nora, and for 2 hours, over roast chicken and mashed potatoes, I sat at that table and existed inside a fiction that felt, disturbingly, less and less like a fiction with every passing minute. It was during that lunch that I first understood how complicated Walter's grief truly was. He was not simply a controlling old man trying to steal his granddaughter away out of spite. He had lost his only son, and in losing Daniel, he had lost the last living piece of his late wife, who had passed away when Daniel was only 22. Walter's fear, buried beneath all his stubbornness and money and lawyers, was the fear of losing Nora too, of watching the last thread connecting him to his son and his wife slip away because Clara might remarry someone who didn't want an interfering old man around, or because life would simply carry them further and further from him with each passing year. I saw it in the way his hands trembled slightly when he asked Nora to tell him about her day at school, in the way his eyes lingered on a photograph of Daniel on the mantel a beat too long. Grief makes people do desperate things, and Walter's desperation had simply worn the mask of control because control was the only language he had ever learned to speak. After Walter left that afternoon, Clara and I sat together on her porch steps as the late afternoon sun slanted gold across the yard, and she told me, for the first time, the full story of her marriage to Daniel, how they had met in college, how he had proposed to her on a hiking trail with a ring hidden inside a granola bar wrapper, how he had been the kind of father who did voices for every single bedtime story no matter how tired he was. She told me about the night of the accident, an icy road and a truck that lost control, and how she had spent the first 6 months afterward simply trying to remember how to breathe. She told me she had never expected to feel anything close to normal again, and that some days she still didn't, but that watching me hold Nora's hand in that hospital room had been the first time in 2 years she had felt like maybe, someday, her daughter's life could include laughter again instead of just careful survival. I told her about my sister, about the particular loneliness of watching someone you love disappear while everyone around you argues about the right way to grieve, and I think that shared understanding of loss was the true beginning of whatever grew between us, long before either of us called it anything close to love. We understood each other's grief without needing to explain it, and there is a rare kind of intimacy in that, the intimacy of two people who have both stood at the edge of the same terrible cliff and somehow found their way back. Over the following weeks, what had started as a single desperate favor slowly became something else entirely. Walter began calling more frequently, always finding reasons to visit, always wanting to see his granddaughter, and always, without fail, expecting to see me there too. Clara and I found ourselves meeting for coffee to plan our answers for his questions, rehearsing small details about a marriage that had never happened, and somewhere in the middle of all that rehearsal, something real began to grow underneath the pretending. I started coming to Sunday lunches even on the weeks Walter wasn't visiting. I started picking Nora up from school on the days Clara's flower shop had a big order to fill. I started noticing that I looked forward to seeing them both far more than I had any right to, given the strange arrangement we had built our friendship on. Nora, for her part, took to me with the uncomplicated openness that only small children possess. She never once asked why I hadn't been at her actual birth, or her first day of kindergarten, or any of the other milestones a real father would have witnessed. She simply accepted me into the fabric of her days, the way children accept sunshine or rain, without needing an explanation for why it exists. She would draw pictures of our family, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a lopsided sun, and hand them to me with a proud smile, and I would tape them to my refrigerator at home, and some nights I would stand in my kitchen looking at those crayon drawings and feel a guilt so heavy it nearly bent me in half, because I knew, even as I fell more in love with this makeshift family, that the foundation we were standing on was made of a lie. I brought this up to Clara one afternoon in early winter, as we sat in her flower shop after closing, the smell of eucalyptus and roses thick in the air around us. I told her I was afraid of what we were doing to Nora, afraid that we were building her sense of safety on a foundation that could collapse the moment Walter discovered the truth, or the moment Clara and I decided this arrangement had run its course. Clara was quiet for a long time, turning a pair of shears over and over in her hands, and then she told me something that I have never forgotten. She said that every parent builds their child's world on some kind of uncertain ground, because none of us know what tomorrow holds, whether it's illness or accident or heartbreak, and that the only real gift we can give our children is showing up for them as fully as we can for as long as we're able, and trusting that the truth, when it finally comes, will be easier to bear because of all the love that came before it. I didn't fully believe her that day, but I wanted to, and wanting to believe something is often the first step toward actually believing it. The winter months brought their own particular tests. Nora caught a severe cold in January that turned into pneumonia, and I found myself sitting in another hospital waiting room, this time not because I had been asked to pretend anything, but because I genuinely could not imagine being anywhere else. Clara barely slept for 3 days straight, and I brought her coffee and clean clothes and sat with her through the long, terrifying hours, and when the fever finally broke and Nora opened her eyes and asked, in a small hoarse voice, whether I would read her the dinosaur book when she got home, I realized that somewhere along the way, I had stopped pretending entirely. I was not performing the role of a father anymore. I simply was one, in every way that mattered, except for the paperwork and the promises that make it official in the eyes of the world. Walter visited during Nora's hospital stay as well, and this time, watching him sit beside her bed holding her small hand in his large weathered one, I saw something shift in him too. He was no longer performing the role of a suspicious grandfather gathering evidence against his daughter-in-law. He was simply a grandfather, terrified for his granddaughter, grateful for every person in that room who loved her as much as he did. After Nora fell asleep that evening, Walter asked me to step into the hallway with him, and he told me, with a rare vulnerability in his voice, that he had misjudged Clara badly in the months after Daniel's death, that his fear of losing his last connection to his son had made him cruel in ways he wasn't proud of, and that watching me with Nora these past months had shown him something he desperately needed to see, that his granddaughter was safe, and loved, and thriving, even without him, controlling every detail of her life. He thanked me, sincerely, for being the kind of husband and father his son would have wanted for his family, and I stood there in that fluorescent hallway with the weight of that lie pressing down on my chest so heavily I could barely manage a response. That was the night I understood I could not continue the arrangement any longer, not because I wanted to stop being part of Nora's life, but because the lie had grown too large, too tangled with real love, to keep pretending it was still just a favor between near strangers. I drove Clara home from the hospital once Nora was stable and resting, and in her kitchen, over cups of tea neither of us drank, I told her that I thought it was time to tell Walter the truth, that I couldn't keep accepting his gratitude for a role I hadn't actually earned, and that more than anything, I couldn't keep pretending that my feelings for her and for Nora were part of some temporary arrangement, because they weren't temporary anymore, not for me. Clara looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face the way you search a familiar landscape for something you're afraid you might have imagined, and then she told me, quietly, that she had been feeling the same way for months, that she had lain awake many nights terrified that what had begun as a desperate favor was becoming the very thing she had promised herself she would never let happen, falling for someone while her daughter's heart was on the line, someone who might walk away the moment the pretending stopped being convenient. But she said watching me at Nora's hospital bed, watching me hold her daughter's hand with the same tenderness Daniel used to have, had convinced her that whatever this was between us, it deserved honesty, even if that honesty came with risk. We decided together that we would tell Walter the truth, not as a confession of wrongdoing, but as an invitation into the real story of how our family had come to be, because by then, we both believed it was a family, even if it hadn't started the way families are supposed to start. We chose to tell him on a bright Saturday afternoon in early spring, in Clara's backyard, with Nora playing nearby on the swing set Daniel had built years before, because we both agreed that whatever happened, whatever Walter's reaction turned out to be, we wanted it to happen in daylight, in the open air, with sunlight on our faces rather than shadows. Walter listened to the whole story without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when Clara finished explaining how it had all begun in that hospital hallway 8 months earlier, he sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, staring out at Nora swinging back and forth against the blue spring sky. Then he asked a single question, his voice low and rough. He asked whether the love between Clara and me was real now, whatever it had been at the start. Clara looked at me, and I looked at her, and I answered for both of us, telling Walter that yes, it was real, more real than I had ever expected anything in my life to become, and that if he needed to be angry with someone for the deception, he should be angry with me, because I was the one who had chosen, every single week for 8 months, to keep showing up. Walter surprised us both. He told us that he had suspected, for at least the last 2 months, that something about our marriage didn't quite add up, small inconsistencies in our stories, the way we sometimes looked at each other like people still learning one another rather than people who had built a life together for years. But he said he had chosen not to press the issue, because whatever was happening, real or performed, had brought light back into his granddaughter's eyes, and he wasn't willing to risk extinguishing that light over his own wounded pride. He told us that watching a stranger become a devoted father to Nora out of nothing but compassion had taught him more about the meaning of family than 30 years of bloodline ever had, and that he owed us both an apology, not the other way around, for ever making Clara feel she had to lie to keep her own daughter safe from him in the first place. That afternoon in the backyard became a turning point not just for Clara and me, but for the entire fractured little family Walter's grief had created. He wept, this proud, silver-haired man who had spent a year threatening lawyers and custody battles, and he asked Clara's forgiveness for the fear he had let curdle into control. Clara, who had every reason to hold on to her anger, chose instead to hug him, right there in the grass, and told him that forgiveness was the only inheritance she wanted to pass on to Nora, because bitterness was too heavy a thing for a little girl to carry. If this story is moving something in you the way it moved me to live through it, I want to ask you gently to leave a comment down below about a time forgiveness changed your own life, or a time someone showed up for you when they didn't have to. Your stories matter to our community here just as much as mine does, and I read every single one. The months after that conversation in the backyard were, in many ways, harder than the months of pretending had been, because now everything was real, and real things carry real risk. Clara and I dated slowly and carefully, mindful of Nora's heart, mindful of the strange path that had brought us together, wanting to build something honest on top of the foundation we had built by accident. We went on daytime picnics by the river because Clara had grown protective of keeping Nora's world bright and sunlit after so much darkness, and I found I preferred it that way too, mornings at the farmer's market, afternoons flying kites in the park behind the elementary school, long golden evenings on the porch before the sun fully set. We were careful never to rush Nora into calling me anything I hadn't earned, and for months, she simply called me Grant, which suited me fine, because I understood that titles like Dad were not mine to claim, only hers to give, whenever and however she chose. There were hard days too. Clara struggled, at times, with guilt over moving forward when Daniel's memory still lived so vividly in their home, in the porch he had painted, in the swing set in the backyard, in the particular way Nora laughed that was unmistakably her father's laugh. I never once asked her to set that grief aside. Instead, I tried to make room for it, to ask about Daniel, to listen to stories about him, to understand that loving Clara did not mean replacing what she had lost but rather standing beside her while she carried it forward into whatever came next. There were nights she cried for him still, nearly 3 years after the accident, and I simply held her, because some grief doesn't need fixing, only company. Walter, for his part, became something none of us expected, not an overbearing patriarch anymore, but a genuinely present grandfather who visited not out of suspicion but out of love. He taught Nora to fish at the small lake outside of town, spending long summer afternoons with her on the dock, patiently untangling her line every time she cast it into a bush instead of the water. He and I grew close as well, in the particular way that men who have both loved the same family fiercely, even from different starting points, sometimes do. He told me once, sitting on that same dock while Nora napped in the shade nearby, that he believed Daniel would have approved of me, not because I looked like his son or acted like him, but because I loved his family the way Daniel would have wanted them loved, without condition, without hesitation, simply because they were worth loving. By the time autumn came around again, nearly a full year after that first desperate afternoon in the hospital hallway, I found myself standing in a jewelry store on a quiet Tuesday morning, holding a small velvet box, my hands nearly as unsteady as Clara's had been the day she first grabbed mine and asked me to pretend. I had thought carefully about how I wanted to propose, and I had decided, without much debate, that I wanted Nora to be part of it, because in every meaningful way, this wasn't a proposal to one person. It was a proposal to a family that had already been built, brick by brick, through a year of daytime picnics and hospital vigils and slow, patient love, and I wanted the little girl who had reached for my hand in a hospital bed before she even knew my name to be standing right there when I asked her mother to make our family permanent in the eyes of the world too. We planned a picnic for the 1-year anniversary of that hospital hallway, though Clara didn't know I was tracking the date so precisely, and I told her I wanted to take her and Nora to the same park where we had flown kites together back in the spring. It was a bright, clear Saturday, the kind of blue-skied September afternoon that feels like summer refusing to let go just a little while longer, and we spread a blanket beneath the same oak tree where Nora had once fallen asleep against my shoulder during a long, lazy afternoon months before. Nora ran ahead of us toward the swings, her laughter carrying across the grass, and I remember looking at Clara in that moment, sunlight caught in her hair, and thinking that I had never in my life felt more certain of anything than I felt of wanting to spend the rest of my days exactly like this, in ordinary daylight, with this ordinary, extraordinary family. I had asked Nora, secretly, the week before, whether she would help me with something very important, and I had explained, in words a 6-year-old could understand, that I wanted to ask her mother to marry me for real, and that I needed her help because she was the most important person in her mother's life, and her blessing mattered more to me than anyone else's. Nora had considered this with the serious, careful expression she reserved for decisions she believed to be very grown-up, and then she had nodded and told me she would help, but she wouldn't tell me how, because it needed to be a surprise. So there we sat beneath that oak tree, the three of us, eating sandwiches Clara had packed that morning, when I finally took a breath and reached into my jacket pocket and knelt down in the grass in front of Clara, and I told her everything I had been carrying in my heart since that hospital hallway a year before, that what had begun as a desperate favor between strangers had become the truest, most unexpected gift of my entire life, that I had watched her love her daughter with a fierceness that had taught me what real strength looked like, that I had watched grief and fear soften into hope and joy over the course of one ordinary year, and that I did not want to spend one more day pretending to be anything other than exactly what I already was to this family, a husband and a father, in every way that mattered, and I was asking now, finally, honestly, for the paperwork and the promise to catch up with what our hearts had already decided months ago. Clara had tears streaming down her face before I even finished speaking, her hands pressed against her mouth, and beside her, Nora had gone very still and very quiet, watching with wide, serious eyes, waiting for the moment we had secretly planned together. And when Clara, overwhelmed, looked down at her daughter as if seeking permission for the joy rising in her chest, unable to quite speak the word yes out loud through her tears, it was Nora who leaned in close to her mother's ear, and in a small voice that somehow carried across the entire quiet park, whispered the words that would echo in my heart for the rest of my life. She said, "Say yes, Mommy." I don't think there has ever been a sweeter sound in the history of the world than the sound of Clara's laughter breaking through her tears in that moment, and the sound of her saying yes, not just to me, but to a future none of us could have predicted the day I sat quietly in that hospital waiting room, minding my own business, waiting to hear news about my grandmother. Nora threw her arms around both of us at once, and we sat there in the grass beneath that oak tree for a long time, holding each other, while the September sun moved slowly across the sky, warm and golden and utterly unhurried, as though the whole world had decided to give us this one perfect, ordinary afternoon. We were married the following spring, in Clara's backyard, beneath the same swing set Daniel had built, because Clara wanted Daniel's memory woven into the beginning of our new life rather than hidden away from it, and I understood, by then, that this was exactly the kind of love I wanted to build a marriage on, love that made room for what came before instead of erasing it. Walter walked Clara down the makeshift aisle of folding chairs arranged across the lawn, since her own father had passed many years earlier, and he cried through the entire short walk, and when he placed Clara's hand in mine, he leaned in and told me, quietly, that he was giving me not just his daughter-in-law, but the last living piece of his son's happiness, and he trusted me to protect it. Nora stood beside her mother as the flower girl, scattering petals with the same seriousness she had shown the day she helped me plan my proposal, and when the officiant asked if anyone wished to say anything before the vows, Nora raised her hand, unprompted, and asked if she could say something too. Through laughter and tears, the small crowd of family and friends who had gathered to watch our unlikely love story reach its happy ending listened as a 6-year-old girl told us that she was glad I had come to her hospital room that day, because she had been scared, and my hand had made her less scared, and she was glad I decided to stay forever. I think about that hospital hallway often, about how close I came to walking past Clara that day, to simply nodding politely and continuing on with my own life, untouched by the desperate love of a mother trying to protect her child. I think about how one small yes, offered to a stranger out of nothing more than shared grief and simple compassion, unfolded into an entire lifetime I never could have planned or predicted. I think about Walter, who taught me that even the hardest hearts can soften when given enough patience and enough proof that love doesn't have to look the way we expect it to in order to be real. And I think, most of all, about Nora, about the particular bravery of a small child's whispered words, about how sometimes the biggest turning points in our lives arrive not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet, certain voice of someone young enough to still believe, without hesitation, in happy endings. Before I close this story, I want to ask you to sit for a moment with whatever it stirred in you, and to leave a comment below sharing the lesson or the feeling that stayed with you most, whether it's about the courage it takes to ask for help when you're desperate, or the grace it takes to forgive someone who once frightened you, or the quiet strength of choosing to love a family that wasn't handed to you in the ordinary way but that you built anyway, one daylight afternoon at a time. I believe stories like this one exist to remind us that we are never quite as alone as our hardest days convince us we are, that a stranger's kindness can become a lifetime, and that sometimes, the people who save us are the ones we never expected to meet at all. If this story touched your heart the way living it touched mine, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment below, share it with someone in your life who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another one of these journeys. Our community here believes in second chances, in the slow and steady rebuilding of broken hearts, and in the idea that family is not only the one we are born into, but the one we choose, again and again, in the small daylight moments that quietly become forever. Clara, Nora, Walter, and I still gather every Sunday for lunch, the same tradition that began with a nervous, pretending stranger sitting stiffly at a dining table a year and a half ago, except now there is nothing pretend about any of it, only gratitude, and laughter, and the steady, ordinary miracle of a family that chose, every single day, to say yes to each other, and to love, and to hope, no matter how it began.